Yeah, it's out there, so we might as well deal with this now. What is editorial fatigue, and why does it fail miserably to demonstrate Markan priority? It's even worse than you think, so let's dive in. I'll start with a disclaimer. I'll spend a lot of this video harshly critiquing arguments by the world-famous religious studies professor Dr. Mark Goodacre, who is the chief modern advocate of editorial fatigue. None of this whatsoever is personal against Dr. Goodacre. I think he's a brilliant man and a gifted educator. I also find him to be sincere and humble in his work, unlike some others. This is purely an engagement on the merits of the arguments themselves, something he's expressly invited us to do, so please take it in that spirit. The best way to describe editorial fatigue is from the explanation provided by Professor Goodacre himself, who says, quote, "The most decisive indicator of Markan priority is evidence that Matthew and Luke made characteristic changes in the early part of pericope where they were rewriting Mark, lapsing into the wording of their source later in the same pericope, so producing an inconsistency or an incoherence that betrayed their knowledge of Mark," end quote. Professor Goodacre gives a bit of helpful color to the argument elsewhere, saying, quote, "Editorial fatigue is a phenomenon that will inevitably occur when a writer is heavily dependent on another's work. In telling the same story as his predecessor, a writer makes changes in the early stages which he is unable to sustain throughout. Like continuity errors in film and television, examples of fatigue will be unconscious mistakes, small errors of detail which naturally arise in the course of constructing a narrative. They are interesting because they can betray an author's hand, most particularly in revealing to us the identity of his sources," end quote. Accepting this definition, there are three key elements to the phenomenon, and we'll discuss shortly why phenomenon is a misnomer here. Number one, a narrative inconsistency between one account and another. Two, a characteristic change that may explain the inconsistency, but then three, a relapse into prior copying, betraying a reliance on the internally consistent copied source. Editorial fatigue is heralded for its explanatory power. It's touted as the quote-unquote phenomenon that helps modern scholars best see why the Gospel of Mark was first. But as we'll show definitively here, there is no power in the argument at all. Editorial fatigue is a circular and thus logically fallacious argument on the issue of priority. That is, it cannot be used to prove priority since it requires the presumption of priority already in its proof. We'll discuss this further later in the video. Additionally, one of the alleged strengths of editorial fatigue is that it's argued to be irreversible. That is, it only occurs in one direction. Professor Goodacre says, quote, "There are undoubtedly several inconsistencies and clumsy expressions in Mark's Gospel, incoherences that on the standard view Matthew and Luke have taken care to tidy up. But this is different from the phenomenon of fatigue. In most cases, Matthew and Luke differ from Mark at the beginning of the pericope, at the point where they are writing most characteristically, and they agree with Mark later in the pericope, where they are writing less characteristically. It is not possible to find the same phenomenon in Mark," end quote. Not possible? As we walk through the examples here, I will show how demonstrably false this claim is. Editorial fatigue is not only reversible, but it arguably has better examples in the other direction. And don't worry, I'll address the editorial fatigue examples on the merits as well, assuming for the sake of argument that the circularity and reversibility arguments don't dispose of them already. We'll still see that editorial fatigue arguments are specious and fail to explain anything we don't already presume them to explain. In short, editorial fatigue fails on multiple grounds, including when framed in its most charitable light. So let's shine that light on some of the examples the advocates put forth. We'll look at cases for editorial fatigue put forth by the proponents, examining them primarily on the merits, adopting the presumptions of editorial fatigue, and accepting the editorial fatigue framework. When descriptions of intentions of the gospel authors are discussed, or where commentary on observations is offered, example, Mark added X or Matthew carelessly did Y, it's merely intended to put the arguments in the light used by the proponents of editorial fatigue. Unless expressly stated otherwise, I'm not adopting those presumptions and characterizations as my own. In this first example, universally cited by proponents of editorial fatigue, we have the infamous story of how Herod Antipas came to behead John the Baptist. The argument here is that Mark refers to Herod as king consistently throughout his narrative, but Matthew starts out by making a characteristic change, in this case by accurately referring to Herod Antipas as Tetrarch before slipping back to calling Herod king. Matthew's change is considered characteristic because he's known for accuracy, and this particular Herod, there were many, was not technically a king, as in a monarch who rules an entire region. Rather, Herod Antipas was a lesser tetrarch, which is one of 4 monarchs who each rule sovereignly over a quarter of a divided kingdom. Antipas was a tetrarch of the region including Galilee, where the events recounted here took place. The argument here is that we have the 3 elements. 1, a characteristic change that 2, creates an inconsistency, which is 3, revealed later when the author lapses back into copying. Presuming we have a characteristic change, we then ask, is there an inconsistency? At first glance, it appears there is. Matthew starts out by referring to a tetrarch, but then seems to lazily slip back into referring to Herod as king. Silly Matthew has just betrayed his reliance on Mark. Or has he? Closer inspection shows no inconsistency at all. When Matthew refers to Herod Antipas by his proper name, he calls him, quote, Herod the Tetrarch. Matthew is using a proper name here. When he's otherwise referring to Herod Antipas generically as the person, i.e. without using the proper title, he simply calls him the common noun king. But he never calls him, quote unquote, King Herod, and Matthew never simply calls him, quote unquote, the Tetrarch, and it appears that no other ancient writer did so either. For example, Luke only refers to him as, quote unquote, Herod the Tetrarch. In fact, of the 5 times the word tetrarch appears in the Bible, 4 from Luke Acts and once from Matthew, it is always either exactly as, quote unquote, Herod the Tetrarch, or as in Luke 3:1, where Luke describes the office of Antipas saying, quote, Herod was Tetrarch of Galilee, end quote. But tetrarch is never used as a common noun to describe the person. For example, the tetrarch said X, or the tetrarch grew angry, etc. It's pretty clear what's happening here. At the time of writing, tetrarch was only ever used in Judea as part of a proper noun or in describing the office. If one was referring generically to the person serving as tetrarch rather than their role, the king was used instead. For example, the king commanded it rather than the tetrarch commanded it. And this makes sense, since to a person from Galilee, the tetrarch was a sole sovereign anyway, of course setting aside the Romans, i.e. their de facto king. This is pretty basic, and it's supported by extra biblical sources such as Ignatius' letter to the Smyrnaeans, as well as in Josephus. These sources only used a proper noun, quote-unquote Herod the Tetrarch, or describe the office Antipas held. Example, he appointed Antipas to be Tetrarch. But I couldn't find anywhere in antiquity where, quote-unquote, the Tetrarch was used by itself as a common noun descriptor. To use a modern example, it's akin to line workers referring to the shift supervisor as, quote-unquote, the boss or, quote-unquote, the chief. In their world, this would be correct and make sense, but the shift supervisor is technically not the boss or the chief. That would be, for example, the CEO. But if asked for a proper name or title, the workers would describe the chief as, say, Tim the shift supervisor. They wouldn't say Boss Tim or Chief Tim. And if talking amongst themselves or telling a story, they'd be more likely to say, my boss said X, or Chief wants to see you, rather than Shift Supervisor wants to see you. In short, Matthew was justified in using both, quote-unquote, the king and, quote-unquote, Herod the Tetrarch in the manner he did, and there's no inconsistency. So without an inconsistency, there really isn't anything to this one. But for the sake of argument, let's assume this is an inconsistency. After all, Mark calls Antipas, quote-unquote, King Herod instead of, quote-unquote, Herod the Tetrarch. But Mark remains consistent and always uses king. It's still worth noting that Mark opens by using a proper title here, King Herod, so that fits with the analysis that, quote-unquote, Herod the Tetrarch was also the proper name. Is there some reason Mark couldn't have come after Matthew and changed Herod the Tetrarch to King Herod? Assuming King Herod is an inaccurate term, Mark is wrong no matter what order he's writing in. Mark could just as easily have come along and chosen to use the word king to create consistency in the otherwise quote-unquote inconsistent Matthew. Hence the circularity problem we have with editorial fatigue arguments generally. They always depend on what priority we assume in framing the analysis. Or perhaps because of his poorer Greek, Mark wasn't familiar with the word tetrarch. We covered this in an earlier video. Antipas's tetrarchy ended in 39 AD, and after that there was briefly a true king before the Romans took control of Judea entirely. It's more likely that tetrarch would have been the term used by someone from Galilee at the time of Antipas, but which would have been meaningless to someone writing later or from outside Judea. At the very least, Mark's usage of the term King Herod by itself cannot be used as a basis to argue that Mark was prior, since it in no way indicates that it was the more primitive usage. There's a second argument in this passage used to support editorial fatigue. In Matthew, it's Herod that wants John killed, and so it seems to be inconsistent when Herod is grieved later by having to behead John. Mark doesn't have this alleged inconsistency because Mark has Herodias, Herod's illegitimate wife, as the one wanting to kill John. Thus, it makes sense that Herod is grieved later in Mark. But again, is there a genuine inconsistency here? Once again, no. We don't force inconsistencies when the plain reading gives us a coherent answer. Both passages have Herod fearing killing John. In Matthew, he feared the crowd because they regarded John as a prophet. And in Mark, Herod was afraid of John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man. So when Herod orders John's beheading, it should be no surprise that slightly different wording is used to describe his emotions. In Mark, where Herod feared John himself because of his righteousness, Herod was very sorry. The Greek word perilipos. This is also translated as extremely sad. Is that the same emotion Herod had in Matthew? No. In Matthew, where Herod feared the crowd rather than John himself, Herod was grieved, the Greek word lipeo. This can be translated as distressed, sorry, or uneasy. It makes perfect sense that a leader who was afraid of the people's reaction would be grieved or distressed by killing John, more for himself and his office than for John. Still, in both passages, it's possible that Herod is sad because of John, or sad because of the crowds, or both. Silence on one doesn't eliminate the other, but in short, there's no inconsistency here. The argument that in Mark's gospel it was Herodias that wanted John put to death rather than Herod is irrelevant. It certainly makes sense that she had an additional reason to want John killed, but the silence about Herod's own desires doesn't preclude Herod from also wanting John killed. And again, Herod was more distressed than sad in Matthew's account. There's just no reason to wedge in an inconsistency here when the plain language gives us a reasonable, consistent interpretation. So to wrap up, there's no case for editorial fatigue here. In my opinion, this argument had the most potential of all the editorial fatigue examples cited by the proponents, and it still failed. That's because when the editorial fatigue argument for the Tetrarch passages is viewed charitably, the circularity rebuttal is weakest against it. All editorial fatigue arguments are circular by definition. That is, when the consistent passage is placed first, it appears that there is fatigue, and when the inconsistent passage is placed first, it appears there is resolution of inconsistencies. But the resolving inconsistencies argument would have been a bit weaker in the Tetrarch example, where Mark may very well have been resolving an inconsistency, but then introduced a separate inaccuracy by wrongly referring to Antipas as King Herod. It's certainly possible and no less circular than the alternative, but in this case, since there's no inconsistency to resolve in the first place, that issue is moot. Let's take a look at another famous example. It's the story of the cleansing of the leper, of which Professor Goodacre refers to the editorial fatigue finding as quote-unquote striking. The argument here is that after Jesus cleanses the leper, he instructs the man to tell no one. In Matthew, so the argument goes, this doesn't make sense because earlier in the pericope, Matthew says large crowds had followed Jesus. Crowds are apparently a calling card of Matthew. In Mark, we don't have this alleged inconsistency because Mark never introduces Matthew's large or many crowds. Thus, according to Professor Goodacre, it's inexplicable that a miracle that has been witnessed by many crowds is to be kept secret. Let's ignore for now some of the easy counter-arguments which show that this is far from inexplicable, and just accept the argument as presented for our analysis. We'll start with what's easy and always true. This argument is circular. Assuming this inconsistency is so inexplicable, it follows logically that Mark could just as easily have come along afterwards and removed the large crowds reference. It's crucial to understand that this is just as likely an explanation of the observation, resolving inconsistencies, as is the editorial fatigue explanation. Arguably, it's better. This is a good point to mention what's really happening here. Editorial fatigue has been described as a phenomenon. Phenomenon, to the extent there is one here at all, is that there is an apparent inconsistency in the pericope of one gospel, where the other gospel has no inconsistency. That's really more of an observation. And editorial fatigue is an explanation of that observation, or if you're into hyperbole, phenomenon. But editorial fatigue is no more a phenomenon than it's a counter option that can also explain the observation. That is, the author is resolving inconsistencies. Keep this in mind as we go through additional cases. So getting back to our cleansing the leper example, we'll again ask if it's really true that Mark doesn't have large crowds. In the two preceding verses to this one, we have in Mark 1:38-39, quote, "He said to them, 'Let us go somewhere else to the towns nearby, so that I may preach there also, for that is what I came for.' And he went into their synagogues throughout all Galilee, preaching and casting out the demons," end quote. Right after this, the leper comes to Jesus. No pun intended. If Jesus is really going to towns and preaching in synagogues, is there any reason why a reader should presume there are no crowds there? Who is Jesus preaching to? Himself? To the extent you still might be thinking this is ambiguous, we have Mark 1:45, which discusses what the healed man did right after getting Jesus' warning. It reads, quote, "But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the news around, to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed out in unpopulated areas, and they were coming to him from everywhere," end quote. So the man runs off and does what? He proclaimed to the crowds what happened. And he was so affected that Jesus could no longer go in public. If Jesus could no longer go in public, then you get it. He must have already been in public previously. But the bottom line is, are we really supposed to buy this as an inexplicable inconsistency? It doesn't even make sense to argue this as inconsistent given the possible explanations. The least sensible read of Mark's narrative given the context is that there were no other eyewitnesses to Jesus' healing, especially given the verses preceding and following his version. And if Mark's version is considered consistent, knowing there must have been eyewitnesses to Jesus' healing the leper in that account, then there's no reason to force a solitude requirement on Matthew. Additionally, there are so many charitable ways to look at the passage in Matthew. The man could have been up close and away from the immediate crowds. Some smaller portion of the crowds may have seen it, but not the rest. Perhaps some people saw something happen but weren't sure what it was, etc. Until each of these are eliminated as possibilities, it's fallacious to read this passage in a way that renders it nonsensical. Lastly, if we're to keep up with this silly argument, we have to deal with another problem. Luke explicitly has Jesus healing the man in one of the cities in his gospel, and yet Luke has the inexplicable command from Jesus to tell no one. Does this mean that Luke also fatigued and in the exact same way? So without an obvious inconsistency, we don't have the phenomenon. And again, if we're forced to accept that this is so strikingly inconsistent, we need to understand why this isn't just as explainable, if not more so, with Mark coming later to resolve it. The more striking the inconsistency, the weaker the editorial fatigue argument gets with respect to priority, because obvious errors are just as likely, if not more, to be fixed by later writers as they are to be explained by prior writers losing focus. Before turning to the reversible examples, let's quickly look at the example of Jesus still in the storm. I've taken this excerpt from a YouTube podcast featuring religious studies professor Dr. Ian Mills. In this example, foolish, careless Matthew, the one also known for his attention to detail, adds in his characteristic word earthquake to the passage to describe a tumultuous natural event in the sea. Editorial fatigue proponents argue that this creates an inconsistency when later Matthew has Jesus rebuking the wind because earthquakes don't cause wind. How foolish of Matthew. Matthew also says that the, quote, boat was being swamped by the waves, end quote. So what causes waves in the sea? According to the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, waves are most commonly caused by wind. This is why nearly every Bible translation of the word Matthew uses here, seismos, which does also mean earthquake, translates the word as great storm or great tempest instead. I couldn't find one that translates this as earthquake. This isn't a fudge. The context of the words used suggests a violent shaking causing winds and waves in the sea. When translators translate from one language into another, they use the context to aid them. It would be a silly reading and thus silly translation to read this as a standard land-based earthquake. Even if Matthew was referring to a windless earthquake in the sea, and I want to be clear that is absolutely a possible reading, it would be a stretch to read this passage that literally. That's because the determination that this was truly an earthquake at sea which generated windless waves, i.e. the definition of a tsunami, would require a meteorological sophistication Matthew would have been unlikely to have. In other words, we'd have to argue that the writer of Matthew literally meant tsunami rather than any other violent sea storm such as a hurricane. And the other parts of the passage strongly suggest that's not what Matthew meant here. Yes, a tsunami can cause waves without wind, but that then leads us to the next observation. Matthew says Jesus, quote, rebuked the wind and the sea, end quote. So we could read this in totality as a careless mistake where Matthew used a wrong word, or we could read this the way the translators do. That is, the writer of Matthew meant to describe a chaotic event in the sea which caused waves to crash and nearly topple the boat. And the waves were caused by winds, by far the most common cause of waves, and Jesus rebuked both the winds and the waves as written. Now, some may push back and say this is apology. But basic principles of literary criticism and logic require us to first try to resolve a potential inconsistency with a charitable interpretation that avoids an inconsistency where none is required. In literary analyses, we first apply the principle of charity, which, quote, constrains the interpreter to maximize the truth or rationality in the subject's sayings, end quote. But it seems that biblical scholars do the opposite. They presume errors and inconsistencies first, even when equally viable charitable options are available. In logic, this needlessly results in straw man, ad hominems, and other fallacies. But even if we went ahead and called this an earthquake or tsunami, as always, this inconsistency would be ripe for a resolution by a later writer. And so again, we have a circularity issue based on how we review the observation here. Okay, time to flip this argument on its head. The most critical aspect to editorial fatigue is that the argument is alleged to be irreversible. It's easy to see why this is essential for the case. If editorial fatigue arguments can apply in both directions, then one would be able to infer little, if anything, from the editorial fatigue explanation as it relates to priority. We've harped on the circularity problem for editorial fatigue already, but circularity alone, while fallacious, doesn't mean per se an argument is wrong. But a circular and reversible argument would be essentially worthless. In sum, for editorial fatigue to have any value whatsoever, it must be irreversible. For the editorial fatigue argument to be reversible, an example would need to include all three of the elements: 1, inconsistency, 2, characteristic change, and 3, lapsing to copying. This means that it would need to be an inconsistent Markan passage with either a consistent Matthean or Lucan one. All the editorial fatigue examples cited by Markan prioritists have, by their definition, consistent Markan passages. So let's look at some examples. A striking exchange occurs in Mark. A man possessed by an unclean spirit approaches Jesus. He shouts in a loud voice and asks Jesus what business Jesus has with him, begging of Jesus, "Please don't torment me." Jesus then commands the singular unclean spirit to come out of the man. The demon refers to himself as Legion because there are many, but each of the references in Mark to this point is to a singular entity. But in Matthew it's different. In the analogous parts, Matthew has, "They cried out," and the man or the demon asked Jesus, "Have you come to torment us before our time?" Each of Matthew's early references are to a plural. As the story continues, both passages have Jesus driving out plural unclean spirits, and all of the previously singular references in Mark become references to plural spirits. Additionally, the reference to legion seems to have been forgotten because legion is never mentioned again. Let's examine what we have. First, do we have a characteristic change? Yes. We have two very Markan findings here. The first is Mark's addition of extra details. Mark routinely has more descriptive detail in shared passages than does Matthew or Luke in the corresponding pericope. One need look no further than the example here. The second is Mark's addition of a proper name, here legion. Several proper names appear only in Mark. Mark often includes personal names, but Luke and Matthew never include names that Mark does not also include. And there's little question of an inconsistency here, and that's especially true when compared with the other editorial fatigue arguments advanced by the Markan prioritists. The man, or the spirit speaking through the man, is very clearly singular in the early passages. This is consistent with Mark's goal of personifying legion and giving the unclean spirit a singular identity. To highlight the contrast here, we can see how the same demon-possessed man describes himself early. He says, quote, "I implore you by God, do not torment me." But then he later says, quote, "Send us to the swine so that we may enter them," end quote. Even if we argue that legion means many, the early passages clearly have legion referring to itself as a singular entity in contrast to Matthew. If we're arguing editorial fatigue, it appears that Mark started with a characteristic change, introducing detail into Matthew's account, including personal names which Mark is known for, but then he lapsed into copying Matthew later in the pericope, creating an inconsistency. All told, this is a far more compelling case of fatigue than any of the ones advanced by the Markan prioritists, and it was not difficult to find. Of course, as always, a later Matthew could have seen this inconsistent account in Mark and fixed it, hence why editorial fatigue proves nothing at all. One case is probably enough to illustrate reversibility. A statistical analysis of why is beyond the scope here, but here are some others. To add strength to the reversibility argument, I've added an example of Mark fatiguing against Luke as well to address any rebuttals that this is a one-off to Matthew. In this example, we have Jesus sending out his apostles in pairs to ministry, and he instructs them to take nothing with them. In Luke, the apostles are instructed to go with, quote, "neither a staff, nor a bag, nor bread, nor money," end quote. We have the same thing in Mark, quote, no bread, no bag, no money in their belt, end quote. But Mark adds in, quote, but to wear sandals, end quote. Again, this is a characteristic additional detail from Mark. The implication with this inclusion is that wearing sandals was not an obvious part of the instructions. For example, in Matthew's version of the story, we have Jesus telling the apostles not to take sandals, quote, do not acquire gold or silver or copper for your money belts, or a bag for your journey, or even 2 coats, or sandals, or a staff, for the worker is worthy of his support, end quote. Mark adds in this detail about sandals, but then later in the passage seems to lapse into lazily copying Luke. Both Mark and Luke recite Jesus' instruction for handling those who reject the apostles' preaching. Rebuke them by shaking, quote, the dust off the soles of your feet, end quote. This makes perfect sense in Luke and Matthew since the apostles are barefoot, but not in Mark since the sand would be on their sandals rather than on the soles of their feet. Again, is this wildly impressive? That's up to you, but it does fit the pattern, characteristic change, creating an inconsistency, and evidence of lapsing back into copying. It's certainly no less compelling than the quote-unquote earthquake at sea or the cleansing of the leper. We don't need more examples to make the case that editorial fatigue is reversible and thus supremely worthless as an argument for or even against Markan priority. But I stumbled on this next one accidentally while looking for something else entirely. These were surprisingly easy to find given the boldness of the claims against reversibility. This one is about the synagogue official's daughter. I love this passage because of the phrase talitha kum. Regardless of your religious predisposition, it's a cute little story and it has some interesting historical flair, for example, the use of Aramaic. This is the story of Jairus, the synagogue official whose daughter is near death. We learn the name of the official from Mark, again adding his characteristic details such as personal names. Matthew simply refers to him generically as a synagogue official. Again, note how much more detail is in Mark's version compared to Matthew's. It's also worth noting that in Mark, the daughter is at the point of dying, while in Matthew, she's already dead. Despite all this, when Mark continues later in the passage, he never refers to Jairus by his name again. Instead, he appears to be lapsing into copying Matthew and refers to him generically as synagogue official. It's not overly impressive, but it fits the pattern if you're looking for it. Again, this analysis assumes the editorial fatigue framework. There are myriad other explanations that can account for this, just as with the editorial fatigue examples the Markan priority proponents advocate. Finally, there's an account of Jesus' disciples forgetting to bring bread on a journey. Again, I found this passage while looking for something else. In Matthew, it is clear that their forgetfulness meant that there wasn't quote-unquote any bread at all. But Mark adds in the extra detail that there was no, quote, more than 1 loaf in the boat with them, end quote. Classic Markan detail. So if we're parsing literally here, there is 1 loaf on the boat in Mark's account. Nonetheless, Mark later goes on to parrot Matthew in the discussions with Jesus, all saying that there wasn't, quote, any bread or, quote, no bread, end quote. This one's admittedly a nitpick, and it can be explained in other ways and is circular, etc. But by the logic of editorial fatigue, again, all the elements are there in reverse. A note on circularity. I've touched on this repeatedly, but circularity remains the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Every one of the editorial fatigue cases put forth by the proponents requires circular reasoning. It is unavoidable, present in 100% of cases. That's because in order to find fatigue, one has to presume that the internally consistent pericope came first. And if we must assume priority to make the argument, we can't conclude that the priority we already assumed is in fact true. This is shockingly basic, but seems to be completely whiffed on by biblical scholars. This should have been the very first challenge a peer or a colleague put forth the moment editorial fatigue was first presented. To be clear, the circularity does not eliminate the possibility that the conclusion is true, but it's overstepping to say that any circular argument proves a conclusion. It proves nothing. Yet this is exactly what the proponents of editorial fatigue continue to do, with zero scrutiny from their peers. Editorial fatigue is a fallacious argument and proves nothing, even where we grant all the examples given as true. And there are other issues with editorial fatigue besides specious arguments, 100% circularity, and demonstrated reversibility. For one, editorial fatigue presumes a change. This is very similar to a circularity issue, but the concern here is that there may never have been a change. For example, even assuming that the writers of the Gospels make things up, a common latent assumption of biblical scholars, and copy blindly, we don't need to presume that there was copying everywhere we see an inconsistency. In fact, many synoptic scholars in other contexts use observed differences to argue that the information came from different sources. Take, for example, the passages on Herod the Tetrarch. It's certainly possible, no less possible than Fatigue, that Mark got King Herod from somewhere else and never even saw the portion in Matthew. Q scholars in particular follow this type of reasoning. The assumption of copying does not hold the same force, if it holds any force at all, where there are inconsistencies. If the two sources have differences, that's at least as strong an argument as not that they got their material from different places. Another obvious problem with editorial fatigue is that where we're required to presume fatigue, we're also required to presume a characteristic change. This means the writer has found something they care enough about to change, but in the very next blink, we're required to presume that that same writer forgot about the thing they cared enough about to change and continued to operate mindlessly. This makes very little sense. The argument would be stronger, at least on this front, if the change was not characteristic. At least then the author wouldn't be expected to maintain it, but that has its own problems, of course. Additionally, we're often expected to argue that the later writer has more attention to detail and is more deliberate, etc. But then in the very next blink, again, we're required to argue that the same scrupulous writer lapsed and goofed up their life's work. So Matthew and Luke get credit for being later when they improve passages, and they get the same credit when they create errors. In short, to make editorial fatigue work, one must constantly argue against the premises we're supposed to be upholding. I've examined the logical case against editorial fatigue elsewhere. You can find a quick review in some of my earlier videos. This analysis was focused on diving into the substance of the arguments themselves. And as we saw, the basis for the arguments for editorial fatigue as it applies to Markan priority are specious at best. They are always fallacious as circular, and editorial fatigue has just as compelling arguments in the reverse. As with the arguments against Mark's redaction profile if he was writing last, which I critiqued in this video linked above, it's time to put the editorial fatigue argument to bed once and for all.